Great. Well, I have the honor of kicking us off. I'm Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. I want to thank all of you for being here. By way of a visual description, I'm wearing a blue suit, seated next to the Vice President in the middle of our U-shaped table here at the White House. And we're delighted to be with you. And of course, I'm very honored to be here alongside Vice President Harris. We know that our country would not be the country that it is today if it weren't for the tireless work of so many disability advocates, from nonprofit leaders to community voices to elected officials, who have spent careers and lives advocating for transformative legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA is unquestionably one of the most significant pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. It expanded rights for 1 in 4 people in our country, and it transformed every aspect of Americans' lives for the better. Having said that, it's worth remembering that at the time it was being debated, the ADA faced a great deal of opposition. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce said that it would have, quote, a disastrous impact on many small businesses struggling to survive, end quote. A congressman, I'm afraid from my own home state, said it would crush, quote, crush small and medium-sized businesses. And the nation's largest bus company predicted that the ADA would, if passed, quote, deprive millions of people of affordable intercity public transportation. Of course, none of those things turned out to be true. Instead, our schools, our workplaces, our communities, our businesses have changed so much for the better that it is difficult to imagine life in America without the ADA. So it is fitting this month, as we mark the anniversary of the ADA, to recommit to our efforts to ensure that people with disabilities can move freely and fairly through every part of their lives, including by means of our transportation systems. To give you an example of some of the work going on this, we've been taking a number of major steps to improve the safety and dignity of air travel. Last year, I had an opportunity to speak with Charles Brown, a Marine Corps veteran and then president of the Paralyzed Veterans of America, who shared the story of how airline staff once dropped him onto the jet bridge while removing him from his wheelchair during boarding, leading to his tailbone being broken and causing an infection that almost cost him his life. And while not every story is that dramatic, I have heard so many stories from friends, including many wheelchair users in this room, about the multiple situations that you have faced dealing with airline travel as wheelchair users. And it's why we've begun laying the preliminary groundwork for a rule that will make it possible for passengers to stay in their own wheelchairs when they fly, affording them the same dignity that so many Americans count on in other forms of transportation. We have also awarded billions of dollars through the infrastructure law that has been led by the Biden-Harris administration to modernize airport terminals, including adding wheelchair ramps, accessible restrooms, and more. And because civil rights are only meaningful when enforced, we are calling on Congress to pass legislation that will ensure that passengers with disabilities can pursue legal action against airlines that violate their rights. Beyond aviation, we're working with automakers to ensure the vehicles of the future, including automated vehicles, serve people with disabilities well. And last December, we awarded nearly $700 million through the infrastructure law to retrofit older rail and subway stations, adding elevators, ramps, and other improvements in a piece of the legislation that was championed by Senator Tammy Duckworth. Now, we know that even with these steps and even with the knowledge of all the good that the ADA has done for America, there are those who will push back on this work too, claiming that it's putting too great of a burden on airlines or automakers or transit agencies. But again, I think it bears remembering that that's exactly what they said about the ADA itself 33 years ago. And history proved that view wrong, and I think it will do the same as we look forward. The reality is that improving accessibility benefits everyone in our country, those with disabilities, those who will age into disability, and everybody else. Because when we empower millions of Americans to live their lives to their fullest potential, we are not only empowering them to thrive, but also ensuring that the country can benefit from their contributions. And with that, it is my great honor to introduce a leader who understands this so well. As Attorney General of California, she helped to shut down predatory health insurance fraudsters whose operation would have disproportionately impacted people with disabilities. As a leader in the United States Senate, she authored legislation that always considered the unique needs of people with disabilities. And as vice president, she has spoken powerfully about the intersection of accessibility and other civil rights, particularly reproductive freedom and voting rights. So it is my great honor to introduce the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris.
Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. As we have blind and low vision folks here today, I will describe what I'm wearing. I'm wearing a lavender color suit and a flag pin, and seated here with all of the colleagues and friends at a U-shaped table. Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg, for your work, for your leadership. As we know, when we think about this movement, which is the fight for the rights, the dignity, for equality, equity, for folks with disabilities, the issue of transportation is a very foundational and fundamental one, and you have been a great leader on this and many other issues through your role of leadership of the Department of Transportation. So I thank you for that. Former Representative Tony Coelho will be joining us when he gets through security, I believe, downstairs, but it is important to recognize his long-standing leadership on this issue, and he continues to be a fighter for all of these rights. So to everyone here, I thank you again. There are many long-standing colleagues and friends in this movement, and thank you again for accepting the invitation to have this important discussion. And as I said before the press came in, for my benefit, mostly so I can hear from you and understand and get feedback from you about the status of where we are in terms of the movement and where we have yet to go. So I want to thank you all for that. So let's start with a fundamental point. Every person in our nation has a fundamental right to participate fully in our society and to determine their own future. The right to self-determination, the right to dignity. And we, as members of a civil society, have a duty. It is not about a whim or a desire, but a duty to ensure that that promise is a reality for all people in our country. And it is with that spirit that we approach this movement, this work, this fight, and this convening today. And the fight for disability rights, Tony Coelho, a great leader in this fight, has been a fight longstanding for dignity and for opportunity and for self-determination, the right of self-determination of all people. So this month, we of course celebrate then a milestone in that fight, which is the 33rd anniversary of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And of course, we can't celebrate these last 33 years with also remembering Judy Heumann, who of course we lost this year, who was a tireless champion. And we will always remember her as being present, actually, always in the work that we are doing. So we celebrate today and this month the progress that we have made, but we also then recommit clear-eyed to the work that we still have yet to do. People with disabilities still face incredible challenges in participating fully in our society. And we have to be responsible and truthful about where we are and what we must yet do. Voting rights, for example. I was proud to convene a group of many of the leaders who are here many months ago to discuss on the issue of voting rights how folks with disability are directly impacted by laws that are being passed in various states that, in my opinion, many are intentional in the desire to make it more difficult for people to vote, not to mention the status quo before those laws, which has created incredible obstacles for people with disabilities to be able to exercise their legal right to have a voice in the future of their country and their government. I've heard stories of polling stations, for example, without ramps. I've heard stories of individuals going to the polling place asking for a private place where they can then, in a private way, register and submit their vote, and having to have the courage, which we shouldn't have to require people to speak in a crowded room about the need to have accommodations. Not being given the dignity to just go in and have those accommodations and be able to vote. on reproductive health care. And we know that since the Dobbs decision, which took that constitutional right from the people of America to make those kinds of decisions for themselves and not have the government decide what is in their best interest. On this issue, we have heard and have learned and know about the disproportionate impact of reproductive restrictions on people with disabilities. For example, for people who live in states that have essentially banned access to reproductive health care, the challenges that are then presented in terms of, again, Secretary, the need to be able to then travel to another state where they will have access to that reproductive health care. And the requirement that then is imposed on them of trying to figure that out through mechanisms that they may not be friendly to or adaptable to their specific needs. Small businesses. A lot of the work that we've been doing with small businesses takes into account that we have to address the barriers to access to capital that folks and small business owners with disabilities face. What am I talking about there? There's still bias in the system around making decisions about who should have access to capital based on some false assumption about who could actually run a small business, who could actually do the work of growing a small business. Are they capable? Some very fundamental issues are at play in terms of the work that we still have to do to have a society that treats all people fairly and equally. And then, of course, one of the most recent issues that has been a topic of discussion around our country among many people, the issue of AI. So let's think about that in terms of algorithms that are being written and employed for a variety of decisions that are being made, including employment decisions, and how ingrained bias, because it still exists in our society about folks with disabilities, can and may be integrated into those algorithms in terms of making decisions in a way that could discriminate against people with disabilities. So we still have a lot of work to do. But today is a day to mostly celebrate the accomplishments that have been achieved since Tony Coelho and so many at this table have been leading this movement. And I again want to thank the Secretary for your work. This issue of transportation is fundamentally about just making sure that people have the ability to get where they need to go. It's that basic. But we know the obstacles to that goal can be great. And for example, when we think about air travel, as the Secretary mentioned, a majority of domestic flights still have no accessible restrooms. When we think about the stories that I've heard of individuals with disabilities knowing that they may not be able to access the restroom on a plane, and what they must do to deprive themselves of food or liquids for hours and hours before that flight, out of concern that they may need to then take care of themselves, but have no access to the ability to do that because that restroom on that plane just does not physically allow that to happen. This is an issue fundamentally, again, about what is morally right, what is right in a society where we say that we prioritize and value the dignity of each human being to be able to live a full life. So with that, I want to thank everyone again. The solutions are at hand. We're going to be announcing some of those solutions very soon. But in conclusion, I would say that an accessible America is a better America. And I want to thank everyone for your leadership. And Tony, would you mind, I know this is a bit off script, but would you mind sharing some of your thoughts before we get into the rest of the meeting?
Thank you, Madam Vice President. I'm sorry everything went wrong today. First off, I just was prepared to say that this is the most pro-disability administration that I have ever seen. And I've been involved in 7 different administrations. Nobody comes close. And you start with President Biden. He was one of the original sponsors of the ADA. Vice President Harris was very involved in disability issues when she was Attorney General, when she was a U.S. Senator, and now what she does now in regards to all kinds of different issues that she's talked about, the same way. She is very aggressively supportive of our efforts, and we appreciate that. Secretary Buttigieg, I've known him, and I went up to him one time when he was speaking, and I said, I'm very impressed. You're going to go someplace at some point. And now here I am sitting with him as on the President's cabinet, which I'm very happy. Transportation, as the Vice President said, is a critical issue for our community. And to have people that oriented towards that and staff that you have, Pete, I think it's fabulous, and I applaud you for it. So with all that, the only last thing I'll say is Carmel Martin, I've known for 6 years. She works She works hard in making sure that our community is included in everything that we wanted. So I appreciate her as well, and I think our community should know that. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
Thank you, the great Tony Coelho. And with that, I'll thank the press for being here, and we're going to now begin our meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. We're going to open you one now.